The flames crackled in the pit, sending dancing shadows against the jagged walls of the cave. Outside, the wind howled through the mountains, carrying with it the distant call of a wolf. Absalom sat near the fire, staring into the flickering light. His cloak was heavy with dust from the road, his boots worn from endless travel. He ran a hand through his thick, uncut hair, a habit when his mind was troubled. A servant approached cautiously, keeping his head low. "My lord, the men are waiting for you." Absalom sighed. "Let them wait." The servant hesitated, then retreated. Absalom clenched his fists. He shouldn't be here. He shouldn't be hiding in a foreign land like a common fugitive. He was a prince, the son of King David, the rightful heir, and yet here he was, cast out, betrayed, forgotten by his own father. His chest tightened as the memories came flooding back. The feast, the laughter, the look on Amnon's face as he realized he was about to die. And then, the silence after the blade fell. Absalom closed his eyes. He could still hear Tamar's cries, could still see her face wet with tears, her hands shaking as she clutched at her torn robes, could still remember the way their father, mighty King David, had done nothing. Absalom's jaw tightened. Nothing. And so, he had done something. He had delivered justice where David had failed, and for that, he had been banished. The wind outside howled louder as if the very land was mourning with him. Absalom stood and stepped outside the cave. The night air was sharp against his skin. Below the cliffs stretched the land of Geshur, his mother's homeland. It was a place of refuge, but it was not home. Never home. A figure emerged from the shadows behind him. Absalom didn't have to turn to know who it was. "You've been silent all night," Recham said. "Are you thinking of Jerusalem?" Absalom exhaled. "I never stopped thinking about it." Recham crossed his arms. "David still sits on the throne. He mourned for you, you know." Absalom let out a bitter laugh. "Mourned? Is that what he did?" Recham was silent. Absalom turned, his eyes burning. "Tell me, did my father mourn for Tamar? Did he mourn when Amnon walked free after what he did?" Recham sighed. "You know the answer." Yes, Absalom knew the answer. David had mourned, but he had not acted. He had wept in his chamber, but he had not given justice to his daughter. And now, after 2 years of exile, did he expect Absalom to come crawling back in shame? Did he think a simple gesture of forgiveness could erase what had been done? Number. It wasn't enough. David was a great warrior, but he had failed to be a king to his own house. And if a king failed his people, then he did not deserve to reign. Absalom took a deep breath, his eyes locked on the dark horizon. "I will return." Recham stiffened. "You will return?" Absalom's voice was like steel. "And when I do, I will not come as a son." He turned back to the fire, his face cast in shadow. "I will come as a king." The streets of Jerusalem buzzed with life, filled with the sounds of merchants calling their prices, children laughing as they darted between market stalls, and travelers passing through the city gates. And in the midst of it all, Absalom stood. Not on a throne, not in a palace, but in the streets, among the people, dressed not as a prince, but as a man of the people, a man who listened, a man who cared, a man who would be king. It had taken time, patience, and careful planning, but Absalom had finally returned from exile, not as a criminal, not as an outcast, but as a forgiven son. David had allowed him back into Jerusalem, but their relationship was not the same. His father had refused to see him for 2 years, and even when they had finally spoken, there had been no true reconciliation, only cold acceptance, only distance. So Absalom had taken matters into his own hands. If his father would not recognize his worth, then he would make the people see it. A man in tattered robes approached, his face weary with hardship. Absalom reached out, gripping his shoulder. "Brother, what troubles you?" The man hesitated. "I have come to the king for judgment, my lord, but no one will hear my case." Absalom sighed, shaking his head. "The king is busy. There are so many in Israel, but so few to bring them justice." The man's face fell. And then Absalom smiled, a warm, charming, perfect smile. "If only I were judge in the land," Absalom said, his voice thoughtful. "Then every man who had a case could come to me, and I would give him justice." The man's eyes brightened. "You would?" Absalom grinned. "Of course. After all, what is a king if not a servant of his people?" The man fell to his knees trying to bow, but Absalom caught him before he could. "No, no, brother. There is no need for that." He pulled the man into a strong embrace, patting his back like an old friend. The man left, smiling, and Absalom watched as the man walked into the crowd, his voice eager, telling others of the prince who listened, who cared, who saw them. Absalom had no crown, but he was already ruling. Day after day, he stood at the gates, meeting men, hearing their troubles, giving them hope. Day after day, he won them. Not with swords, not with war, but with words, with charm, with the promise of something better. And soon, the whispers began. Absalom should be king. Absalom is strong, wise, just. Absalom would give us justice. And when the whispers grew into cheers, Absalom knew it was time. That night, in the darkness of his chambers, his most loyal men gathered. Recham stood beside him, arms crossed. "The city is yours, my lord. The people love you." Absalom smirked. "Of course they do." Another man, Hoshai, leaned forward. "Then why wait? Claim the throne now." Absalom raised a hand. "Not yet." His eyes gleamed in the candlelight. "First, we must go to Hebron." Recham frowned. "Why there?" Absalom turned to face them. "Because that is where kings are crowned." Silence. Then Recham grinned. "Then let us go." Absalom exhaled, looking out the window at the palace in the distance. David was asleep in his bed, unaware of what was about to happen. The kingdom was his for the taking, and when he returned from Hebron, it would not be as a prince. It would be as a king. The night sky over Hebron stretched wide, a canvas of endless stars. The city was alive with voices, torches burning bright in the streets as if the heavens themselves were watching what was about to unfold. Absalom stood at the highest terrace, looking down at the gathering crowd. His men were waiting, the people were waiting, and soon the kingdom would be his. Recham, his most trusted advisor, stepped beside him. "It's time." Absalom inhaled deeply. He had spent years preparing for this moment, winning the hearts of the people, proving he could rule where his father had failed. Now, it was all within his grasp. He turned to his men, his voice steady. "Sound the trumpets. Let all of Israel hear." Recham nodded and gave the signal. And in the next breath, the city of Hebron erupted with shouts. Absalom is king. Absalom reigns in Israel. The sound spread like wildfire, carried by messengers who rode hard through the night, whispering into the ears of soldiers, governors, and noblemen. It was no longer just talk. Absalom was not just a prince who had the people's hearts. He was a king now. The next morning, Absalom stood in the city square, his face composed but his heart pounding with fire. His men gathered around him. Some were seasoned warriors, others loyal men who had followed him in exile, but among them stood someone new, Ahithophel, David's former counselor, a man of great wisdom, great power, and, most importantly, great resentment toward David. Absalom turned to him. "Will you stand with me?" Ahithophel studied him for a long moment. Then he smiled. "The throne belongs to the strongest, and right now, the strongest is you." Absalom smirked. "Then let's take it." Word reached Jerusalem faster than expected. Nathan, the prophet, stood beside David as the old king sat in his chamber, hands folded, face grim. A breathless messenger knelt before him, his voice shaking. "Absalom has declared himself king in Hebron. The people follow him. Even your own men follow him." David closed his eyes. He had seen this coming. From the moment he had allowed Absalom back into Jerusalem, from the moment he had failed to confront him, he had known one day this would happen. And now it was too late to stop it. He stood, his voice slow but firm. "We must leave the city." Nathan frowned. "My lord, you still have loyal men. You could fight." David shook his head. "If we fight in Jerusalem, the city will burn. The people will suffer for my sake. No, I will not let that happen." He turned to his servants. "Gather what we can. We leave before the night is over." And just like that, David, the great king of Israel, became a fugitive in his own land. Absalom stood at the gates of Jerusalem, watching as David's forces slipped away into the hills. His father had chosen to flee rather than fight. Absalom smirked. The great warrior David, running like a coward. Ahithophel stood beside him, his face unreadable. He still has loyal men. He is no fool. He will wait, and he will strike when he is ready. Absalom turned to him. "Then we strike first." Ahithophel nodded. "Give me the command, and we will ride tonight. We will cut him down before he has time to gather strength." Absalom's heart raced. It would be so easy. One battle, one strike, and David would be nothing but a memory. The throne would be his, uncontested. He opened his mouth to speak, but another voice cut in. "Wait!" They both turned. Hushai, another of David's former counselors, stepped forward. His eyes gleamed with something calculated, clever. "Ahithophel is a great strategist, but do not underestimate your father." Hushai's voice was smooth, convincing. "David is a man of war. If you chase him now, you will not catch him off guard. He will set a trap. He will destroy you." Absalom frowned. "Then what do you suggest?" Hushai smiled. Patience. Let him run. Let him grow weary. Meanwhile, you gather the full strength of Israel. When you finally meet him in battle, you will crush him completely. Absalom hesitated. Ahithophel's jaw tightened. Number. This is a mistake. If you wait, you give David time. End this now. Absalom looked between them. Ahithophel. Wise, direct, brutal. Hushai, clever, persuasive, careful. Finally, he made his choice. We wait. Ahithophel stiffened. You are making a grave error. Absalom smirked. Number, I am taking my time. The throne is already mine. My father is already running. I have already won. Ahithophel's face darkened, but he said nothing. As the men left the chamber, Absalom turned toward the palace window, looking out over his city, his kingdom. His father had fled. His army was growing. The people were his. And soon, all of Israel would bow before him. He was no longer a prince. He was a king. But he did not yet realize a king is only as strong as the foundation he stands on. And his, cracked by pride and betrayal, would soon crumble beneath him. Absalom stood in the royal chambers of Jerusalem, his fingers running across the ornate carvings on the throne. David's throne. Number, his throne. It had once been his father's, yes, but David had abandoned it. He had chosen to run instead of fight. That alone proved what Absalom had always suspected. David was weak. The city belonged to him now. The people belonged to him now. So why did it still feel like he was waiting for something? The door swung open, and Ahithophel entered, his face grim. You made a mistake, Absalom. Absalom smirked. You seem to say that often, old friend. Ahithophel didn't laugh. You should have listened to me. You should have struck your father down the moment he fled. Absalom sighed, reclining in his seat. And risk falling into one of his traps? I know my father, Ahithophel. You think him an old man, but he is still the warrior who took down Goliath. He is still the man who ran from Saul and survived. If I had attacked too soon, I would have walked straight into his sword. Ahithophel shook his head. That is where you are wrong. David is not the man he once was. His strength is fading, his men are few. If you had acted quickly, he would be dead already. Absalom's smirk faded slightly. And yet, he still runs. Ahithophel stepped closer. Not for long. Absalom raised an eyebrow. You have a plan? Ahithophel nodded. Let me take 12,000 men. I will ride out tonight and strike him while he is weary, before he can gather an army, before he can even think. I will bring his head back to you before the next sunset. Absalom tapped his fingers against the arm of the throne, thinking. It was a good plan, a simple, brutal plan, one that could end this war before it truly began. But before he could answer, the chamber doors opened again. Hushai stepped in, his face unreadable. You cannot do this, my king. Ahithophel turned, his eyes narrowing. You again? Absalom leaned forward. Go on, Hushai, convince me. Hushai stepped closer. Ahithophel is wise, but he is impatient. He underestimates your father. David is no fool. If you attack now, you will not find him sleeping. You will find him waiting. Ahithophel scoffed. You give David too much credit. He is a desperate man, fleeing for his life. Hushai held Absalom's gaze. He is a warrior, Ahithophel. He has fought battles longer than you have breathed air. If you send 12,000 men tonight, you will not be sending an army. You will be sending lambs to the slaughter." Absalom exhaled slowly, rubbing his jaw. Ahithophel glared at Hushai. "Then what do you suggest? More waiting?" Hushai smiled. "Number, the eyes suggest we strike with the full force of Israel, gather every man who is loyal to Absalom, not 12,000, not 20,000, but an army so great that even David's finest warriors will tremble." Absalom's eyes gleamed. "An army so great that none will ever challenge my rule." Hushai nodded. "Exactly." Ahithophel's face darkened. "You are wasting time. The longer you wait, the stronger David becomes." Absalom raised a hand. "Enough!" The room fell, silent. Absalom turned to Hushai. "Gather the men." Ahithophel's jaw tightened. "You are making a grave mistake." Absalom leaned back in his seat, smiling. "We shall see." Ahithophel bowed stiffly and left the chamber. Hushai bowed as well, then followed. Absalom sat in silence for a moment. The throne beneath him was solid. But for the first time, he felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Ahithophel rode away from Jerusalem that night. He did not pack his bags. He did not say farewell. He simply left. Because he knew he had served many kings. He had advised David and now Absalom, and he had never been wrong. If Absalom had listened, this war would be over. But now David had time to gather strength, time to set traps, time to remind the world why he was called the warrior king. Ahithophel pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of a valley. He looked up at the dark sky, then exhaled. "I will not live to see it." He knew what was coming, and he refused to watch it unfold. That night, he took his own life. And as the sun rose over Jerusalem, Absalom did not even notice he was gone. Absalom stood before the great army, thousands upon thousands of men standing in the fields, shields gleaming in the light. His heart swelled with pride. This was his kingdom now. He turned to Hushai, smiling. "See, I made the right choice." Hushai nodded, but his eyes were distant. "Indeed, my king." Absalom raised his sword high. "We march at dawn." The men cheered. They believed in him. They followed him. But none of them knew the truth. None of them knew David was already waiting. None of them knew this was the beginning of the end. Absalom believed he was marching to his greatest victory. But in reality, he was marching to his death. The air was thick with the scent of dust and iron as Absalom stood at the edge of the battlefield. Before him, his army stretched across the valley, thousands of men armed with swords, spears, and the belief that today they would claim victory. David's forces were hidden within the dense forest of Ephraim, waiting like wolves in the shadows. Absalom smirked. "This is where my father makes his last stand." Recham rode up beside him, his horse kicking up dust. "The men are ready, my king. Give the word, and we will crush them." Absalom inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the moment. He had spent years preparing for this day. He had taken the hearts of the people, taken his father's throne, and now he would take David's life. This was his destiny, his kingdom, and no old warrior, no matter how many battles he had won, could stop him now. Absalom raised his sword high. Forward! The army roared in unison and charged into the trees. The moment they entered the forest, everything changed. The trees were thick and twisted, turning the battlefield into a labyrinth. David's men were not waiting in formation. They were waiting in ambush. From the branches above, arrows rained down, cutting through Absalom's soldiers. From the shadows, David's warriors struck like lions, vanishing before they could be caught. Absalom's confidence wavered. "Stay together!" he shouted, but it was too late. The battlefield was no longer a battlefield, it was a slaughter. Men screamed as they fell into hidden pits, trampled one another in the chaos, or were cut down before they even saw the enemy's faces. And worst of all, David was nowhere to be found. This wasn't a battle, it was a trap. And Absalom had walked straight into it. A horn sounded in the distance. Absalom turned sharply. It was David's signal, which meant his father was close. His anger ignited. He kicked his horse forward, tearing through the chaos of battle, cutting down anything in his way. He would find David himself. He would end this. He would dash. A low-hanging branch caught him across the chest. Before he could react, the impact ripped him from his horse. His body twisted violently in the air before his hair. His thick, flowing hair, the hair that had made him famous, caught in the tangled branches of a great oak tree. His horse galloped forward, and Absalom was left dangling, his feet kicking helplessly in the air. Pain shot through his scalp as he struggled, trying to free himself, but the branches would not let him go. Panic set in. He could hear the battle raging below, but no one saw him. No one knew he was here. He was trapped. A prince caught not by the sword, not by an enemy, but by his own pride. And then, the sound of footsteps, Absalom's breath caught. Someone had found him. For a brief moment, hope flickered in his chest. Perhaps it was one of his men. Perhaps they would cut him down, get him back on his horse, and he could still turn this battle around. But then, he saw the face of the man who had come. Joab, David's fiercest commander. The man who had been loyal to his father from the very beginning. And the look in Joab's eyes told him everything. There would be no rescue, no second chance, only judgment. Absalom swallowed hard. Wait! But Joab did not wait. The general drew his spear, and, without hesitation, he drove it into Absalom's chest. Pain exploded through Absalom's body. His breath came in ragged gasps, the world around him blurring. He could hear Joab's men behind him, see the figures moving through the trees. His army was gone. His men were dead or fleeing, and he was nothing. He had climbed so high, had built his kingdom, had convinced himself that he would be the greatest king Israel had ever seen, and now he hung from a tree, bleeding into the dirt. A prince without a crown, a king without a kingdom, a son who had betrayed his father and lost everything. Back in Mahanaim, David stood in his chambers, his hands shaking. He had not fought this battle. He had not even been there. But when the messenger entered, he already knew. The young man knelt, his voice soft. May all your enemies be as that young man is. David's heart stopped. Absalom. The boy he had held in his arms as a child. The son he had loved despite everything, despite his rebellion, despite his betrayal, despite everything. David staggered forward, his voice breaking. "Oh, my son Absalom!" His knees hit the ground. My son Absalom." His cries filled the chamber, his sobs shaking the walls. Would that I had died instead of you! But it was too late. Absalom was gone, and the house of David would never be the same again. Absalom's body hung motionless in the great oak tree. His once proud, flowing hair, the symbol of his vanity, his charm, his power over the people, had become the very thing that betrayed him. Blood soaked his tunic. His hands, once gripping the reins of a war horse, now hung limp. His army was gone. His throne lost. His father, his greatest enemy and the man he had sought to destroy, still lived. And Absalom? Absalom was dead. Joab stood beneath the oak, staring up at the lifeless body of the prince. He did not bow. He did not mourn. He turned to his men, cut him down. They hesitated. One of them spoke carefully. "My lord, the king ordered that Absalom be spared." Joab's expression hardened. The king was weak. Absalom would have never spared him. The men said nothing. They knew it was true. Joab gave a curt nod, and the body was pulled from the branches, unceremoniously dropped onto the dirt. No royal burial, no words of honor, just a hole in the ground, a pit dug deep in the forest. And there, Joab and his men threw Absalom's body into the earth. They piled stones over him, not a monument, but a warning. This is what happens to traitors. And then, without another word, they rode back to David's camp. Far away in the city of Mahanaim, David sat in his chamber, his face buried in his hands. He had already heard the news. His son was dead. Nathan's prophecy had come true. The sword will never depart from your house. And now, the weight of it crushed him. David, the mighty warrior king, the man who had defeated Goliath, who had conquered nations, who had built Israel into a mighty kingdom. He could not even save his own son. The room was silent, but his mind screamed. Was this the price of Bathsheba? Was this the cost of Uriah? Was this the punishment for his own failures as a father? David stood abruptly, his breath ragged. He needed air. He staggered out of the chamber, moving past the guards, past the courtyards, past the city gates, and then he collapsed onto the ground. His fingers gripped the dirt. His voice rose into the evening sky. "Oh, my son Absalom! My son Absalom!" His shoulders shook. Would that I had died instead of you, Absalom? My son, my son. His cries echoed into the night, and the people of Israel, who had once cheered for David's victories, now wept with their king. For though David had won the war, he had lost his son, and that, above all, was a price he could never repay. The weight of Absalom's death hung over Israel like a dark cloud. The rebellion was over. David's throne was secure. But nothing felt like victory. The people whispered in the streets, some mourning the prince who had once promised them justice, others relieved that the kingdom had not been torn apart. And David? David was lost in grief. For days, he refused to leave his chamber. He would not eat. He would not see his advisors. He would not celebrate his victory, because to David, this was not a victory. This was punishment. His son had died at the hands of his own men, and though he knew Absalom had betrayed him, though he knew that the young prince had taken the kingdom by force, David could not stop loving him, could not stop grieving him. And as he lay awake at night staring at the stone ceiling, he heard the whisper in his heart. the sword will never depart from your house. This was the price of his own sin, and now he would bear it until his dying breath. Outside the palace walls, the army of Israel waited. Joab, David's most ruthless commander, stood with his men, his jaw clenched. The battle was won. The king's throne had been secured. And yet, David sat in mourning, as if he had lost. The soldiers who had fought and bled for him stood outside, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting for their king to stand tall. But David did not come. And Joab had had enough. Joab marched into the palace, pushing past the servants. The doors to David's chamber swung open, and there he was. David sitting in silence, his eyes red from weeping. Joab didn't bow, didn't hesitate. His voice cut through the heavy air. You humiliate every man who fought for you today. David flinched, but Joab did not stop. They risked their lives for you, my lord. They fought for you. They won for you. And here you sit, grieving for the man who would have killed us all. David's fingers dug into his robe. Joab stepped closer. If Absalom had lived, do you think he would be weeping for you? Silence. No. Joab's voice was sharp. He would be sitting on your throne. He would be celebrating your death. And yet here you are grieving him while the men who fought for you stand outside waiting to be acknowledged. David closed his eyes. He knew Joab was right, but his heart was still broken. Joab exhaled, shaking his head. If you do not go out there now, by tomorrow you will have no kingdom left. Then without another word, Joab turned and left. The door slammed shut behind him, and David sat there, alone. For a long time. When David finally emerged from the palace, the people turned to him in silence. His men stood at attention, waiting, watching. He stepped forward, standing tall, even though his heart was still heavy. He lifted his chin, and he spoke. Not about Absalom, not about his sorrow, but about his people, about his kingdom, about the future, because the truth was, he was still their king. And Israel still needed him. In the years that followed, the kingdom of Israel would grow stronger, but the house of David would never fully heal. The cracks that had begun with Bathsheba, with Uriah, with Amnon, would remain until the end of his days. David would continue to rule. He would prepare the way for Solomon, but he would never forget. He would never stop hearing the whisper. The sword will never depart from your house. And in the quiet moments when the halls of his palace were empty, he would still find himself whispering into the night, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son, my son." Because some wounds never heal, and some prices must be paid until the very end. Because some wounds never heal, and some prices must be paid until the very end.